Welcome to The Sustainable Edge, your podcast that moves sustainability beyond talk. You get to hear sharp perspectives and leave with insights you can put into action. I'm your host, Joachim Nahem, and this podcast is produced by Position Green.
David, what makes you most optimistic about the climate agenda right now? What makes you think, feel, hope that we're on a good pathway, notwithstanding bumps in the road and things we could spend the entire podcast on speaking about challenges, but what makes you optimistic?
Two of the biggest things that I see are, one, rising policy and civic action. This issue is front and center, and even the fact that we continue to see the inadequacies of policy and of the outcomes of the COP process year on year is both dispiriting, but it also means that our levels of ambition continue to rise, and we're seeing countries make policies that are in line with that. You look at the policies before the Paris Agreement, not even a decade ago, and you look at where they were right after Glasgow, and you look at them today, and we're not in a static policy environment. It's a kind of funny quirk of modeling that the IEA and others will look at this current policy scenario where we just imagine somebody flips a switch and no policies go on. So I think we are beginning to see policies have teeth, have effects on moving markets. And then the other thing is just technology and markets are moving in such nonlinear ways. We always talk about tipping points in climate in the bad sense of forests dying, but this is actually kind of the opposite, which is overall market share of EVs in a number of countries has passed 25% in some of the Scandinavian countries. Even in the US, we're well past 5% from just about 1% a few years back. And so, as I was saying before about the deployments, most new energy that is being built is low carbon. And so we're really getting to this phase where I think these changes are going to start taking big chunks out of the demand. In the past, we've talked about kind of a green island floating on a sea of carbon, but I think we're beginning to change that. And it's, to be honest, going to change a lot more rapidly, I think, than we think. So between that and between the escalating policy, the two are self-reinforcing. We've seen technological change that has been agnostic by policy. We've seen policy shifts that haven't brought about new technology. We have both, and they're both pulling in the same direction now. And I think that that's really exciting.
That's it for this episode of Sustainable Edge. If you found today's conversation inspiring, make sure to subscribe and leave us a review. It helps more sustainability leaders find us.